He's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist celebrating the first anniversary of his 28th year in advertising.
And he's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director, and the author of 2 books on the creative brief. And together, we're the Brief Brothers, and we love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Well, Howard, we're back with another episode, and today we thought we'd get back to some nuts and bolts discussion about creative briefs, specifically the briefs that agencies write. And the what spurred me to bring this topic back up was I was going through old files and putting them on an external hard disk because we're doing a computer migration and the whole thing. And I found this document. It's actually a document from WARC. Um,
Which
and
stands for the World Advertising Research Center. And I want to point out that it was founded in 1985. So this year, they're marking their 40th year in existence. So kudos to them.
Yes, and a great resource. A lot of agencies are members and have access to a deep library of thought leadership from work. But this particular piece, the title is "Creating the Agency Brief," and the author is Merry Baskin, and it's under Work Best Practices from June of 2010. So it's old, but like a lot of things that are old or relatively old, it has value, and I and
Absolutely.
I thought it certainly has value in terms of spurring our discussion today about briefs. And um, longtime listeners and viewers will know that the genesis of this podcast actually came from one day that you sent me a document about co-creating a creative brief between the client and the agency. And my take on it was beautiful in theory, but in practice, just not viable. Doesn't really work in practice. And I've outlined over the years a few of the reasons, but it's interesting because that's pretty much the question that Mary Baskin starts this paper with, which is why do agency planners find it necessary to rewrite the client communications brief, transcribe it into their own formats, and fill out their little boxes with their special headings before handing it over to the creative department? Right. So that's the question: is like, why do we need to take the client briefs and make our own version? And she gives some possible answers. She says, is it about control? Is it because client briefs are notoriously inadequate?
Oh, not that one. Never.
Is it because clients don't know how to inspire those tricky nonconformist creative types? Planners are certainly trained to question everything in the client brief, not to take anything at face value, and keep asking why like an annoying toddler. So
Yep.
I think the answer is all of the above. I think we've talked about the Better Briefs Project and the big disparity between how clients view the briefs they write and how agencies view them. And I think that certainly plays into it. But in the third paragraph, she gives what I think is a really cogent argument. She says, in fact, developing the communication strategy, defining the role it has to play in addressing the brand's problem, and then transcribing it into a brief for the creative team is the pivotal stage when the agency starts to add value.
You just want
And,
to rub it in, don't you, Henny? You just love to rub it in. Because what he's
and
not telling you is that I defended this counter argument, which was that there should be one brief. I defended it for 5 minutes, maybe 10, until I eventually conceded that you had a better point than I did. But that's
and
okay. That's
and
okay.
my
It started a great conversation that's been going on for 4 years.
and my point isn't to rub it in, but to for people that are attacking this problem now, maybe for the first time in their careers, a young strategist or someone who's moved into strategy, maybe from another department, is, you know, that the reality is the way I see it, and she elegantly puts it here, saying, it's the pivotal stage when the agency starts to add value is I see the agency's creative brief as the first step in the creative process
Yeah.
rather than the last step in an order taking process from the client, where the client is basically giving you an assignment. And then we're kind of taking that assignment as given to us by the client, internalizing it, and then restating it in a way that more uh, fulfills the needs that the agency has, in terms of what a brief should look like. And so I I think that this is an argument in favor of having two separate briefs. And honestly, it's also, related to this debate is, whether the agency's creative brief should be approved by the client or not. And I know a lot of clients require seeing and approving even an internal agency brief. My personal preference is when I can get away without showing it to them. I like to do that. They'll always see some form of it. Typically, when we go to present the creative, that brief will be the basis for whatever strategy setup that I insert into the presentation or into the pitch. It'll come from the thoughts from that creative brief.
I think she endorses the idea that the agency should use the creative brief that they've written as, and she says here at the very bottom of the first page, if shared, because now she says it's conditional. So if this document is shared with the client, it marks the first step towards meeting agreed objectives and demonstrates that the agency understands the problem. For these stakeholders, it forms an agreed basis for judging the output. So that's one of the things that I've talked about in my training. And the lessons for me in this seeing this document, and then of course the 4 years of conversation that you and I have had on many other topics, but this is the one that got us started, is that more and more of the marketers that I'm working with through the Association of National Advertisers, which is the company that I've been working for the last 8 years, those marketers who have many more responsibilities than you do as a strategist have expressed a very serious interest in learning how to write this document. They want to do it better. They understand the weak points of their own efforts. And when I show slides from that study or that survey that you alluded to a moment ago from betterbriefs.com, Peter Paul Von Wheeler and Matt Davies did this survey. And it's a 45 slide deck that examines the yawning gap between what marketers think about their own briefs and what the creative agencies think about those same briefs. And I don't show all slides because I don't want to depress my workshop attendees before we even get started, but I show them two or three, and they all nod and they say, "Yeah, this is true. This is right." So I think what's evolved a little bit, at least since you and I started talking about this, is a greater awareness among at least some brand marketers of how important this document is. Whether they're actually getting better at it, that's harder to judge. But there's no excuse anymore. I don't think there's any way anyone out there in the marketing world can say, I didn't know that I was writing such a bad brief. The evidence is right in their face.
So I agree completely. I'm also looking at this document, and she breaks down, the creative brief's core 4 C's. And again, this is not new territory for us, but I think that it's worth repeating what those
Mhm.
are. And she says concise, right? So we know it's a brief, not a long, clarity. And this is what I say, at the end of the day, I have two jobs. One is to be clear and to inspire. And if I can be clear, that's most of the job done. Then she says consistency, and we don't talk a lot about this. I have talked about it a couple of times, but the internal logic of the brief. It should hang together with the pieces fitting snugly like a jigsaw puzzle, building to form a complete picture. And that's why when I teach brief writing, I always tell them it doesn't matter which question or box you start with. Like, let's say you have a really good idea for a single-minded proposition, but everything should kind of work together. So let's say you didn't start with a good idea for a single-minded proposition. You started with a target audience description. And then as you started writing the different parts of the brief, you came up with something. It's always good to go back. I always say cut and paste is your friend. And you can take out the parts that don't have internal consistency with what ultimately you're arguing for, which is that single minded proposition or that insight. And so I think that probably we don't pay enough attention. And I think that that's where briefs tend to get long, right? Like, is when you have a bunch of stuff in there that isn't really going anywhere. You're going down streets or roads that aren't leading you ultimately to what the core of the brief is, which is that single minded proposition. And then the last C is creativity. If there's a leap at the briefing stage, there's more likely to be a leap in creativity. Or put another way, if the brief is lacking imagination and flair, then you can't expect anything different from the creative team. Now, I don't
Yep.
100% agree with that. Like I said, I think really good creatives can come up with a great creative from a brief that's clear and not necessarily super creative. Because
I agree with that. And we have evidence of that. I've seen some of the briefs that are on the Creative Brief Archive on my website that are not anything close to being sexy or interesting, but they are so clear, and they basically say to the creative team that the right as if you, the writer of the brief, were saying to the team, "I trust you. I know you can solve this one." Even though it's really simple. I want to go back to the consistency one and recall that slide from Peter Paul von Wheeler and Matt Davies' survey, the one that said 90% of the marketers admitted that they changed the brief after the creatives had been briefed in. That's a kind of consistency that is, well, it's inconsistency, and it drives us nuts. As a former creative, working creative, that would drive me crazy. I mean, look at the
well,
equivalent.
it's like changing the architectural plans on a project that you're already building, right? Like,
That's the analogy I love to use. Exactly. The
yeah,
architect designs the house. A week into the building of the house, he says, "Whoops, I want to put the kitchen on this side."
I mean that's incredibly inefficient and
Yeah,
expensive,
right,
and ultimately the the product at the end is going to suffer because of the lack of that consistency.
right. I was fascinated by these formatting options. I mean, I guess I've not heard them described in these particular terms, but I've seen them in practice. So she describes the single-minded proposition, the stimulus and response, and the critical realism framework. And I'm quite frankly, I've never heard of the critical realism framework. And this document is 15 years old. So either I've just been out of it, or that's just not one that we use. No, we got to remember, this is a document written by someone in London, and maybe we just don't, it hasn't translated itself to the others, to this side of the pond, as they say. What are your thoughts on that, Henry?
Well, let's first go through the first two. I think the
Okay.
single-minded proposition is easy for everyone. I think that's the model that most people use.
Yep.
Um, Although stimulus and response, I think if I'm reading this correctly, is like kind of like what does the audience think now and what do we
Yeah.
want them to think after being
Hmm.
exposed to the advertising? And I've seen both of these combined into one formatted brief. In fact, for many years, I used both of these kind of paradigms in a single brief format. I would give the what the current state is and what the desired state is, and then what that single-minded proposition that's going to get us to that desired state. Now we can read this block of text about the critical realism framework. People are just as influenced by communications processed with low attention and minimal conscious recall as by rational factual messages consciously processed. Neuroscience has demonstrated that most of our decision making is rooted in and influenced by our emotions. So, what you say in terms of messaging is less important than how you say it. Executional elements, visuals, sounds, symbols, music, gestures, casting, location, and context all contribute in their own right to any brand communication over and above verbal content. Measuring success on the basis of of message transmission is deficient. Tracking should also focus on how people behave. Increased preference, favorability is communication's true objective. So anyway, I
This
don't
is reminding me a little bit of what Byron Sharp was talking about with
yeah,
distinctive brand assets.
and what I think is probably like an early um look into basically behavioral economics
Hmm.
and behavior change as something that you're trying to achieve through creative work. Um, I don't know really how to put that into place in a brief. I do have the current brief format that I use. I tried to tailor it to a more Byron Sharp approach. I don't use words like insight. We've talked about this. I say, what's the most interesting thing we can
Yeah.
say about
Hmm.
the brand, the target, or the situation? I have a section in my brief for distinctive brand assets to call them out. Like, what do we own, and what do we can we use to reinforce the brand in people's minds so that they know that it's us when we're speaking to them. And so I typically I at least pay lip service to some of those things, even if my brief is more traditional, single-minded proposition in nature.
I was also looking at the last section of her document. It's a very short document, and are will we be able to include a link?
Yes, we can I'll upload it and I'll provide a link.
Okay. The last section of this document before the additional reading is called the seven components of the brief. And she goes through, this is a checklist. The one that I have a question about, because on the briefs that I teach from and the ones that I speak the most highly of, do not have this one. It's the last one, seven, measurement criteria and methods for evaluating communication performance. Now, I'm not making a statement here that this is unimportant. All I'm saying is that if we look at the creative brief as the kickstart, the first step of the creative process, which is designed to be clear, to explain what's going on, and we all hope to inspire us, I don't need to know as a creative how you're going to measure the success of this thing that hasn't been created yet. Marketers need to know that. Client needs to know that. But as the creative team, I don't need to know that. So what I say when I'm talking to my marketers in the workshops I do, put that on page two and
In
make it a very short page two.
in theory, you're right. But I think that in practice, like if their client has certain measures that they use on a consistent basis, and we as an agency have kind of developed ways to hack that, we're always gonna, you know what I mean? Like if you know that a certain type of communication results in a certain type of spike in a measurement criteria that you're being judged upon, I think it's worth it to know that ahead of time.
Well, I would counter that by saying we can go back to previous episodes where you and I dissected what we both agreed were great briefs by professionals and students alike, and none of these briefs had KPIs.
So that could be that they didn't have them, that they were omitted from whatever form we ended up seeing because we get these
No, I think no.
second
This is
hand.
I'll point out the Kiwi brief written by Sarah Walker Hall. That was the entire brief.
Yeah,
I'll look at the BBC brief that
but
was done by.
absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence. So
That's very clever, and you're there. To which I would say copywriter alert. But I'm still saying I have lots of examples of finished briefs that don't have KPIs. And
again,
again, and the argument I make is they're important, but creatives don't need to know this. I don't need to know this when I'm coming up with an idea. How am I going to measure
well,
something?
you also say that you don't need number four, which is the budget,
True.
and here she has number four on here. So
I know. So
and
it's just
I've
fun to have
argued
a disagreement.
and I've argued passionately that if you know what the client's budget is, it's good to put it in there because it helps kind of establish a baseline of we're not going to propose a Super Bowl ad if the client has a $10,000 budget.
And
Uh,
my counter argument to that is, why is it that the creative team is rarely asked, if you come up with $1 million idea and we only have $40,000, can you execute it on 40,000? How often have we been asked to do that? And my answer is not often, because that's one of the things that we do well, is how to execute an idea that might be way out of the league of any budget, but we can still do it with a little bit of creativity.
well, I know
Food for
I,
thought.
I know my creatives and my producers like for that number to be in there so that we don't start off with a big mismatch in expectations on what's gonna happen in this, remembering that briefs are written for everything from a postcard to a Super Bowl spot,
Right.
so there's a lot of range in there for you to get it wrong, in terms of size and scope of an idea.
Well, look at this, Henry. We've had another disagreement. It's been years.
I think it's more frequent than that.
Well, maybe. But anyway, this is a great piece of resource, a great resource from an organization that does an amazing amount of research. You have to be a member to get access to it. So if you work at an agency that does have an account, by all means, dig in. If you don't, bug somebody who's got the purse strings, because it's valuable information. So, Henry, thanks for bringing this to our attention. This was a great little opportunity for us to revisit an argument that got us started 4 years ago, and we're still talking to each other. Isn't that amazing?
Amazing.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till
Still,
next time. Bye bye. Still.
still.